The last time I saw Ruth, the sky was the color of old bruises, purple and blue, with a thin line of gold pressed against the horizon. She stood at the window, her hands resting on the sill, the lamplight behind her turning her hair to a kind of halo. I remember thinking she looked like a ghost, or maybe just someone waiting for something she knew wouldn't come. The mill let out late that evening. I walked home with the cold biting at my ankles, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache, even through thick socks and boots. The snow had started again, soft and slow, settling on the roofs and fence posts, muffling the world until all you could hear was your own breath. Our house sat at the edge of the field, a single lamp burning in the front window. It was Ruth's lamp. She always turned it on at dusk, said it made the house feel less lonely. I could see her shadow moving behind the curtain as I came up the walk. She didn't wave, didn't open the door, just stood there, still as a photograph, watching the snow fall. I paused on the porch, brushing the ice from my collar, and listened to the quiet. Inside, the radio played something low and sad, one of those old songs Ruth liked, the kind that made you feel like you were remembering something you'd never lived. When I stepped inside, the warmth hit me first. The stove was going, wood smoke curling in the air, mixing with the faint smell of soap and wool. Ruth had left her knitting on the arm of the chair, a half-finished scarf trailing onto the rug. She turned when she heard me, her face soft in the lamplight. "You're late," she said, not unkindly. I shrugged, set my lunch pail on the table. "Snow's coming down harder," I told her. She nodded, eyes drifting back to the window. I watched her for a moment, the way her fingers traced the glass, as if she was drawing something only she could see. We ate dinner in near silence. The fork scraped against my plate, the clock ticked in the hallway. Ruth's hands were steady, but she barely touched her food. She asked about the mill, about the men, about the weather. I answered, but my words felt heavy, like stones dropped in a well. Afterward, she cleared the dishes, moving slow, careful not to make a sound. I sat by the stove, boots off, watching the flames flicker behind the grate. The radio played on, a woman's voice rising and falling, soft as a lullaby. Ruth hummed along, just under her breath, the tune familiar but distant. She didn't sit with me that night. Instead, she stood at the window, arms folded, watching the snow pile up against the fence. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but the words wouldn't come. There was a kind of hush between us, the kind that grows over years, slow and quiet, until you hardly notice it's there. I went to bed first. Ruth stayed up, the lamp still burning in the front room. I lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the eaves, the soft creak of the floorboards as she moved around the house. At some point, I must have drifted off, the warmth of the blankets pulling me under. I woke in the dark, the house colder than it should have been. Ruth's side of the bed was empty, the sheets still tucked in neat. I called her name, softly at first, then louder. No answer. I got up, feet bare on the cold floor, and checked the front room. The lamp was off, the radio silent. Her coat was gone from the hook by the door. Her boots, too. I opened the door, the wind cutting sharp against my face. The snow was deeper now, covering the porch steps, the path to the gate. I saw her footprints, small, careful, leading out into the field. They glowed in the moonlight, a trail of shadows pressed into the white. I stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into my bones. The world was silent, except for the distant sound of the river, half frozen, moving slow under the ice. I tried to tell myself she'd gone to check on the chickens, or maybe just needed air, but the coop was dark, the yard empty. I followed her footprints as far as I could, out past the fence, into the open field. The snow was up to my knees, the wind stinging my eyes. Her tracks went on, straight and sure, until they disappeared into the drift by the old willow tree. I called her name again, but the wind carried it away. By morning, the snow had covered everything. The footprints were gone, the field smooth and untouched, as if no one had ever walked there at all. I stood at the window, the same place Ruth had stood the night before, and watched as the sun rose over the white. The house felt empty, the silence heavy and close. I found her scarf on the chair, the one she'd been knitting. It was unfinished, the needles still threaded through the last row. I picked it up, held it to my face, and breathed in the scent of her. Soap, wool, something sweet and sad. I wondered what could have drawn her out into the bitter dark, what she was looking for, out there in the snow. Or maybe what she was running from. The lamp in the window stayed dark that morning. I waited for her shadow to return, but the glass only showed my own reflection, pale and uncertain, watching the world go quiet. And somewhere out in the field, the snow kept falling, soft and endless, covering every trace she left behind. The river was always the coldest place in town, even in summer. In winter, it turned to a ribbon of ice, slow and silent, winding its way past the edge of our fields. I never liked walking there, not after Ruth disappeared. But that morning, word spread through Larkspur like a shiver. Something had washed up on the far bank, tangled in the reeds where the water moved slowest. I heard it first from Mrs. Harlan, who came to the door with her scarf pulled tight and her eyes wide. "They found something by the river," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "You should come." I didn't want to go. My hands shook as I pulled on my boots, the laces stiff with old mud. The air outside was sharp, the kind that stings your lungs and makes your eyes water. I walked down the lane, past the empty chicken coop, past the willow tree where Ruth's tracks had ended. The snow was thinner here, trampled by the boots of neighbors and children, all drawn by the same quiet dread. The riverbank was crowded, but no one spoke. They just stood in a loose circle, staring at the thing caught in the reeds. It was Ruth's quilt, her last, unfinished work. I knew it by the colors, faded but still bright against the gray of the ice. Reds and blues, a patch of yellow like a sunbeam, all stitched together in her careful hand. The water had dulled the fabric, made it heavy and limp, but the pattern was still there. I pushed through the crowd, my heart pounding in my chest, and knelt in the snow. I reached out, fingers numb, and pulled the quilt free. It was soaked through, cold as stone, but I held it close anyway. The smell of river mud clung to it, sharp and earthy, mixed with something sweet, maybe the last trace of Ruth's perfume, or maybe just my memory playing tricks. I turned it over, searching for something, anything that might explain how it had come to be here. The others watched, silent, their breath rising in clouds. Someone cleared their throat behind me. "Is it hers?" I nodded, unable to speak. My throat felt tight, as if I'd swallowed a stone. I wanted to tell them to go, to leave me alone with the quilt and the river and the cold, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood, the quilt heavy in my arms, and started back toward the house. The crowd parted for me, their faces pale and uncertain. Inside, I spread the quilt across the kitchen table. The colors looked different in the lamplight, softer, almost blurred. I traced the stitches with my thumb, following the pattern Ruth had chosen. She always said every quilt told a story if you knew how to read it. I tried to remember the last time I'd seen her working on this one. She'd been quiet, her brow furrowed, lips moving as if she was talking to herself. I hadn't asked what she was thinking. I wish I had. As I smoothed the fabric, my fingers caught on something strange, a seam that felt thicker than the rest. I pressed it, and the edge gave way, revealing a small pocket sewn into the lining. My breath caught. Ruth never added pockets to her quilts. I reached inside, heart pounding, and pulled a slip of paper, folded small and stained with river water. The writing was blurred, the ink running in places, but I could still make out the shape of Ruth's hand. The words were simple, but they trembled on the page. I read them once, then again, the meaning sinking slow as the cold. It was a confession, something she'd carried with her, something she hadn't told me. I sat down hard, the chair creaking beneath me, and let the paper fall to the table. The house felt smaller, the walls pressing in. The radio was silent, the stove cold. I listened to the wind rattle the window panes, the distant sound of the river moving under the ice. I thought about Ruth, about the way she'd stood at the window, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I wondered what it cost her to keep this secret so stitched close to her heart. I wanted to be angry, but all I felt was tired and hollow, as if the river had washed something out of me too. I picked up the quilt, held it to my chest, and closed my eyes. The fabric was rough against my cheek, the scent of river mud sharp in my nose. I tried to remember the sound of Ruth's voice, the way she laughed when the radio played her favorite song. But all I could hear was the wind and the slow, steady drip of water from the quilt onto the floor. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and relentless, covering the footprints in the yard, the path to the river, the place where Ruth's tracks had ended. What secret she'd carried with her into the snow, what sorrow had driven her out into the bitter dark. I wondered if I would ever understand the story she'd left behind, stitched into the fabric of her last quilt, hidden in a pocket meant for no one to find. The lamp in the window stayed dark that night. I sat at the table, the quilt spread before me, the confession lying open in the lamplight. The house felt silent, except for the faint sound of the river moving slow and cold beneath the ice. I waited for morning, for the sun to rise over the fields, for some sign that Ruth might return. But the only thing that came was the snow, falling soft and endless, erasing every trace of what had been. The house felt different after the quilt came home. Not quieter exactly, just emptier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I moved through the rooms with a kind of carefulness, afraid to disturb the silence Ruth had left behind. The kitchen was the worst. Her chair sat pushed back from the table, a half-moon of worn floorboards beneath it, the cushions still holding the shape of her. I found myself glancing at it, expecting to see her there, hands folded in her lap, eyes on the window. I spent most of that morning in her sewing room. The door creaked when I opened it, the hinges stiff from the cold. The room was small, tucked at the back of the house, with a single window looking out over the orchard. Ruth had always kept it tidy, spools of thread lined up by color, fabric folded in neat stacks, scissors gleaming on the shelf. Now everything felt untouched, as if she'd only stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. The air was thick with the scent of lavender sachets she tucked into her drawers, and something else, dust maybe, or the faintest trace of her perfume. I sat in her chair, the seat still warm from the sun that crept through the window. The cushions sagged under my weight, the fabric soft and worn. I ran my hand over the table, feeling for something, some sign, some message she might have left behind. There were scraps of fabric everywhere, little triangles and squares, some with patterns I recognized, others new to me. I picked up a piece of blue calico, traced the edge with my thumb, and tried to remember the last time I'd seen her working here. She'd been quiet, humming to herself, her needle moving in and out of the cloth with a kind of steady patience. I'd watched her from the doorway, wanting to say something, but the words had felt too heavy, too late. The radio sat on the windowsill, silent now. Ruth used to listen to it while she worked, the voices and music filling the room with a kind of gentle life. I turned the dial, but all I got was static, a thin, empty sound that made the room feel colder. I turned it off and sat in the quiet, listening to the house settle around me. The floor creaked, the pipes groaned, the wind rattled the glass. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the sound of Ruth's laughter, the way it would bubble up out of nowhere, surprising both of us. I opened the drawer where she kept her patterns. Inside, I found a notebook, the cover soft from years of handling. I flipped through the pages, sketches of quilts, lists of fabric, little notes in Ruth's careful hand. On one page, she'd written a line from a poem. "The world is full of paper. Write to me." I stared at it for a long time, the words blurring as my eyes filled with tears I didn't let fall. I wondered if she'd meant it for me, or if it was just something she liked, a scrap of beauty to keep her company. I found her thimble on the floor, rolled under the table. I picked it up, turned it over in my palm. It was dented, the metal worn smooth where her finger had pressed it, day after day. I held it tight, as if I could squeeze some part of her back into the room. But the chair across from me stayed empty, the silence unbroken. I thought about the last conversation we'd had. It was nothing special, just talk about the weather, the price of eggs, the way the snow was piling up against the barn. But there was something in her voice, a distance I hadn't noticed before. She'd looked past me, out the window, her eyes following the line of the fence to where the field met the sky. I'd asked if she was all right, and she'd smiled, small and tired. "Just thinking," she'd said. I hadn't pressed her. I wish I had. I sat in her chair until the sun moved off the window and the room grew cold. The shadows stretched across the floor, long and thin, reaching for the corners. I listened to the house, to the quiet that felt heavier with every passing hour. I wondered if Ruth had felt it too, this weight, this emptiness that pressed in from all sides. I wondered if that was why she'd left, why she'd walked out into the snow without a word. I stood and looked around the room one last time, the fabric, the thread, the unfinished projects, each one a piece of her, left behind for me to find.
I closed the notebook, set the thimble on the table, and smoothed the cushion of her chair. I wanted to believe she'd come back, that she'd walk through the door and pick up where she left off, but the room stayed empty, the chair untouched. As I left the sewing room, I paused in the doorway, looking back at the chair, bathed in the last light of afternoon. The air was still, the dust motes drifting in the sun. I closed the door softly, the latch clicking into place. The house felt smaller, the silence deeper. I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the quiet, and wondered what Ruth had been thinking in those final days, what sorrow she had carried, what hope she had lost. I wondered if I'd ever know. That night I sat at the kitchen table, the empty chair across from me. I traced the grain of the wood with my finger, listening to the wind outside, the slow ticking of the clock. The house was full of Ruth's absence, every room holding a memory, every silence a question. I waited for her voice, her laughter, her gentle touch, but all I heard was the quiet, settling in like dust, filling the spaces she'd left behind.
The morning after the quilt was found, the town gathered itself into a search party. It was the kind of cold that made your breath hang in the air, the kind that turned your eyelashes stiff and white. I watched from the porch as neighbors pulled on boots and scarves, their faces set with a quiet determination. No one spoke much. There was a heaviness to the way they moved, as if the snow itself was pressing down on their shoulders. I joined them, though my heart wasn't in it. I kept thinking of Ruth's empty chair, the unfinished scarf, the confession hidden in her quilt. The orchard behind our house was the first place we looked. The trees stood bare and black against the snow, their branches reaching up like hands. The ground was uneven, the drifts deep in places, but we found a trail, faint, almost lost, but there. Small footprints pressed into the crust of old snow, weaving between the trunks. I followed the prints, my boots crunching in the silence. The others fanned out, calling Ruth's name in voices that sounded too loud for the morning. I didn't call. I just listened, to the wind, to the creak of the trees, to the memory of Ruth's laughter echoing through the orchard in warmer months. She used to pick apples here, her skirt brushing the grass, her hands quick and sure. I could almost see her, moving ahead of me, just out of reach. The footprints led us past the last row of trees, out toward the open field. Here, the snow was deeper, the wind sharper. The prints grew fainter, swallowed by drifts and the slow, steady fall of new snow. I knelt down, brushing the surface with my glove, trying to keep the trail alive. My breath fogged the air, my fingers numb. I thought about the night Ruth left, about the way she'd stood at the window, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the orchard. Someone called out from the edge of the field. I stood, heart pounding, and hurried over. But it was nothing, just a scrap of fabric caught on a branch, a piece of Ruth's old apron maybe, or something left behind by the wind. The searchers looked at me, their faces full of questions they didn't ask. I shook my head and we moved on, the silence growing heavier with every step. We searched for hours, circling the field, combing the edges of the woods. The snow made everything look the same, white and endless, the horizon blurred by falling flakes. I lost track of time, lost track of the others. It was just me and the footprints, fading into nothing. I thought about the stories Ruth used to tell, about getting lost in the orchard as a girl, about finding her way home by the sound of her mother's voice. I wondered if she'd been listening for me, if she'd hoped I would follow. By midday, the trail was gone. The snow had covered it, smooth and unbroken, as if no one had ever passed that way. I stood at the edge of the field, the wind tugging at my coat, and looked back at the house. It seemed farther away than I remembered, small and lonely against the white. I felt a kind of emptiness then, a hollow ache that settled in my chest. I wanted to call Ruth's name, to fill the silence with something, but the words stuck in my throat. The others gathered at the fence, their faces red from the cold, their eyes downcast. No one wanted to say it, but we all felt it. The search was over, at least for today. We trudged back to the house, boots heavy with snow, hearts heavier still. I watched the orchard disappear behind us, the trees swallowed by the falling light. I wondered if Ruth had stood here, looking back at the house, wondering if she'd ever return. Inside, the warmth felt strange, almost unwelcome. I peeled off my coat, my gloves, my boots, and sat by the stove. The radio was silent, the house full of the hush that comes after hope has faded. I thought about the footprints, about the way they'd led us out into the field and then vanished. I thought about Ruth, about the secrets she'd carried, about the confession hidden in her quilt. I sat there until the sun went down, the light fading from the windows, the shadows growing long. I listened to the wind, to the creak of the house, to the silence that pressed in from all sides. I wondered where Ruth had gone when the world stopped leaving traces. I wondered if she'd found what she was looking for, out there in the snow, or if she was still searching, still waiting for someone to follow. That night, I dreamed of the orchard, of Ruth moving between the trees, her laughter drifting on the wind, her footprints leading me deeper and deeper into the white. I woke before dawn, the house cold and dark, the memory of her voice fading like the last light in the window. I lay there, listening to the silence, and wondered if I would ever find my way back. The attic was a place I rarely went, especially in winter. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step sending up a small cloud of dust and memory. The air was colder up there, sharp and thin, carrying the scent of old wood and mothballs. I brought a lamp with me, the kind Ruth used to keep by her bedside, its yellow light trembling in the draught. The floorboards groaned as I crossed to the far corner, where Ruth kept boxes stacked neatly, each one labeled in her careful hand. I knelt beside a box marked Keepsakes. The cardboard was soft at the edges, the tape yellowed and curling. I opened it slowly, as if I might disturb something sleeping inside. The first thing I saw was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. There were photographs, too. Ruth as a girl, her hair in braids, her smile wide and unguarded. I sifted through them, the paper soft and thin, the images blurred at the edges by time. I found the letter near the bottom, tucked between a pressed flower and a postcard from the coast. The envelope was addressed in Ruth's handwriting, but not to me. The name was unfamiliar, Eleanor. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it, the way the paper seemed to hum with something unspoken. I hesitated, then slid my thumb under the flap and opened it. The letter was dated years before I met Ruth. The ink had faded, but her words were clear, each line written with a steady, careful hand. She wrote of regret, of longing, of a promise she hadn't kept. She spoke of a summer spent by the river, of laughter and secrets shared beneath the willow tree. She wrote of a love that had changed her, and a goodbye that had left her hollow. I read the letter twice, then a third time, the meaning settling in, slow and heavy. I sat back on my heels, the lamp casting long shadows across the rafters. I tried to picture Ruth as she was then, young, hopeful, her heart open to the world. I wondered who Eleanor was, what she had meant to Ruth, what had been lost between them. The attic felt smaller, the air tighter, as if the walls themselves were listening. I thought about the confession in the quilt, the sorrow in Ruth's eyes, the silence that had grown between us. I wondered if this letter was part of that silence, a piece of her past she'd never shared. I wanted to be angry, to feel betrayed, but all I felt was a kind of aching tenderness. Ruth had been someone before she was my wife, someone with dreams and heartbreaks, with secrets she'd carried like stones in her pocket. I sat there for a long time, the letter trembling in my hands. The wind rattled the window, the house settling around me. I thought about all the things I'd never asked Ruth, all the stories she'd never told. I wondered if she'd meant for me to find this, or if it was just something she'd left behind, a scrap of her heart folded away in a box. I closed the letter, retied the ribbon, and placed it gently back in the box. I ran my hand over the photographs, the pressed flower, the postcard from the coast. Each one felt like a doorway to a life I'd never known, a version of Ruth I'd never met. I felt a kind of grief then, not just for her absence, but for all the years we'd spent together, side by side, never truly seeing each other. The lamp flickered, the shadows shifting across the floor. I stood, my knees stiff, and looked around the attic one last time. The boxes, the dust, the quiet. All of it felt sacred, a testament to the life Ruth had lived before me. I closed the box, set it back in its place, and made my way down the stairs, the letter's words echoing in my mind. Back in the kitchen, I set the lamp on the table and sat in the dark, the letter heavy in my pocket. I listened to the house, to the wind outside, to the silence that filled every corner. I thought about Ruth, about the girl she'd been, about the woman she'd become. I wondered if she'd ever truly left that summer by the river, if some part of her was still waiting beneath the willow tree, hoping for a different ending. That night I dreamed of Ruth as a girl, her laughter bright and wild, her eyes full of hope. I woke before dawn, the house cold and still, the memory of her voice fading with the light. I lay there, listening to the quiet, and wondered who Ruth had been before she was mine, and whether I'd ever really known her at all.
It was nearly dusk when I saw her, a figure moving slow along the road, her coat pulled tight against the wind. The sky was the color of slate, the last light slipping behind the orchard, and the world felt hushed, as if holding its breath. I watched from the window, the same place Ruth used to stand, my hand pressed to the cold glass. The woman paused at the gate, her breath rising in small clouds, her eyes searching the house as if she was looking for a sign. I didn't recognize her. She was older than Ruth, with hair pulled back in a loose knot and a tiredness in her shoulders that I understood. She stood there for a long moment, gloved hands wrapped around a small bouquet of wildflowers, dried, brittle, gathered from somewhere the snow hadn't yet claimed. I wondered if I should go out, but something in her posture kept me still. She looked like someone carrying a burden, the kind that makes you walk slower, speak softer. Finally, she opened the gate and walked up the path, her boots leaving careful prints in the snow. I met her at the door, the cold rushing in around her as I opened it. She didn't smile, but her eyes were kind, the color of river stones. "I'm sorry to trouble you," she said, her voice quiet, almost apologetic. "I was hoping to ask about Ruth." The sound of Ruth's name in a stranger's mouth made my heart stutter. I stepped aside, letting her in, the warmth of the house closing around us. She stood in the entryway, looking around as if she could still see Ruth moving through the rooms. She held the flowers out to me, her hands trembling just a little. "For her," she said. I took them, unsure what to say, and set them on the table beside Ruth's unfinished scarf. We sat in the kitchen, the lamp casting a soft circle of light. She didn't take off her coat, just sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the window. I poured tea, the steam curling between us, and waited. The silence stretched, gentle but heavy, like the pause before a storm. Finally, she spoke. "I knew Ruth a long time ago, before she came here. We were close." She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Friends, I suppose, though it was more than that in some ways." Her voice was careful, each word chosen and measured. I listened, the ache in my chest growing sharper. She told me about summers by the river, about secrets shared in the shade of the willow tree. She spoke of laughter and promises, of a bond that had faded but never truly broken. Her eyes glistened in the lamplight, but she didn't cry. "I heard what happened," she said softly. "I thought I should come, just once, to say goodbye." I wanted to ask her about the letter in the attic, about the name Eleanor, about the part of Ruth's life I'd never known, but the words felt clumsy, too heavy for the quiet between us. Instead, I asked how she'd found us, this far from where their story began. She smiled, a small, sad thing. "Ruth wrote me once, years ago. I kept the address." She looked down at her hands, twisting her gloves. "I always meant to visit, I just never did." The tea cooled between us, untouched. The house felt full of ghosts. Ruth's laughter in the hallway, her footsteps on the stairs, her secrets folded into every corner. The woman stood, smoothing her coat, her eyes lingering on the wildflowers. "She was a good friend," she said. "She carried so much, more than most ever knew." She paused at the door, her hand on the knob. "I hope you find peace, in time." I watched her walk back down the path, her figure growing smaller against the snow. She didn't look back. The wildflowers sat on the table, their stems brittle, their colors faded but still bright in the lamplight. I sat for a long time, listening to the wind, the silence settling in around me. I thought about Ruth, about the life she'd lived before me, about the people who had loved her, and the secrets she carried. That night, I placed the wildflowers on the windowsill where Ruth's lamp used to burn. The house felt different, as if a door had opened and closed, letting in a breath of something old and unfinished. I wondered what connection the woman had to Ruth's hidden life, what stories they'd shared that I would never know. I wondered if Ruth had been waiting for this goodbye, or if she had already made her peace, somewhere out in the snow. The sky outside was dark, the orchard lost in shadow. I stood at the window, watching the last traces of the visitor fade into the night, and felt the weight of all the things left unsaid. The house was quiet, the wildflowers bright against the glass, and somewhere in the darkness, I hoped Ruth knew she was remembered. The quilt sat folded on the table for days, its colors dulled by river water, its weight a constant presence in the house.
I found myself drawn to it, running my fingers over the stitches, searching for meaning in the patterns Ruth had chosen. The confession I'd found hidden in its lining haunted me, words blurred by water but heavy with sorrow. I read them over and over, trying to hear Ruth's voice in the silence, trying to understand what she had carried all those years. One afternoon, when the sky was the color of pewter and the wind rattled the windows, I wrapped the quilt in brown paper and walked to the edge of town. The snow was deep, the roads empty, the world muffled in gray. I made my way to Mrs. Larkin's house, the oldest seamstress in Larkspur, and a friend to Ruth since the first winter we arrived. Her house was warm, the air thick with the scent of cinnamon and old wool. She opened the door before I could knock, her eyes sharp and kind behind her glasses. I held out the quilt, my hands trembling. "I need your help," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. She nodded, ushering me inside, her movements slow but sure. We sat at her kitchen table, the quilt spread between us, the lamplight catching on the faded threads. Mrs. Larkin ran her hands over the fabric, her fingers gentle, her eyes tracing the patterns with a practiced gaze. "She put her heart in her work," Mrs. Larkin said softly. "Every stitch means something if you know how to look." She pointed to a patch of blue, the color of the river in spring. "That's for hope," she murmured, "and this," her finger moved to a square of deep red, "for loss." We sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I watched as she turned the quilt over, examining the seams, her brow furrowed in concentration. She found the hidden pocket, the place where Ruth had tucked her confession. She read the words slowly, her lips moving, her eyes growing wet. When she finished, she folded the paper and set it aside, her hands resting on the quilt as if to comfort it. "She told me once," Mrs. Larkin began, her voice trembling, "that she'd done something she couldn't forgive herself for, something from before she came here." She looked at me, her gaze steady. I never asked what it was. I thought if she wanted to tell me, she would. I felt a wave of grief then, sharp and sudden. I thought of all the times Ruth had sat at this table, her laughter mingling with Mrs. Larkin's, her hands busy with needle and thread. I wondered how much of her sorrow she had shared, how much she had kept hidden, even from those who loved her. The confession was simple, but the pain behind it was raw, a secret love, a promise broken, a child lost to time and silence. Mrs. Larkin reached across the table, her hand warm on mine. "We all carry things we wish we could change," she said. "But Ruth, she carried hers alone." I nodded, unable to speak. The room felt heavy with memory, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. I thought about the visitor at dusk, about the letter in the attic, about the life Ruth had lived before she became my wife. We sat together until the light faded, the quilt between us, the confession lying open in the lamplight. Mrs. Larkin told me stories I'd never heard, of Ruth as a young woman, fierce and gentle, full of dreams and fears. She spoke of the day Ruth arrived in Larkspur, her eyes bright with hope, her heart already scarred by loss. I listened, piecing together the fragments of a life I'd only ever seen in glimpses. When I left, the sky was dark, the snow falling soft and steady. I carried the quilt home, its weight different now, heavier but somehow less lonely. I thought about forgiveness, about the ways we try to mend what's broken, about the stories we stitch into the fabric of our lives. I wondered if Ruth had found peace, if she'd forgiven herself, if she knew how deeply she was loved. That night, I spread the quilt across our bed, the confession tucked safely beneath my pillow. The house was quiet, the wind whispering at the windows, the silence full of Ruth's memory. I lay awake, listening to the sound of my own breath, and wondered what Ruth needed forgiveness for, and whether I could ever give it, to her or to myself. Winter deepened, and the world outside seemed to shrink beneath the weight of snow and silence. The days blurred together, gray mornings, long afternoons, nights that stretched on and on. I found myself drawn to the field where Ruth's footprints had vanished, as if some answer might be waiting there, hidden beneath the drifts. Each morning I pulled on my boots and coat, the cold biting at my skin, and walked the same path she had taken, out past the orchard, through the gate, and into the open white. The field was a different place in winter. In summer, it was alive with the hum of insects, the sway of tall grass, the gold of wildflowers. Now it was a wide, empty sheet, the snow unbroken except for the wind's restless patterns. The sky hung low, heavy with clouds, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots and the slow, steady beat of my heart. I stopped at the place where Ruth's trail had ended, the memory of her footprints still vivid in my mind, even though the snow had long since covered them. I stood there, the cold seeping through my coat, and tried to imagine what Ruth had felt that night. Was she afraid, or was it something else? A kind of release, a letting go. I remembered how she used to talk about the field, how she loved the way it looked in the early morning, the way the mist curled along the ground, the way the world felt endless and quiet. I wondered if she had come here to find peace, or if she had simply wanted to disappear, to let the snow erase her from the world. The wind picked up, sharp and insistent, tugging at my scarf, stinging my cheeks. I closed my eyes and listened, hoping for some sign, some whisper of Ruth's presence. But there was only the wind, the distant creak of the old willow tree, the slow settling of snow. I knelt down, brushing the surface with my glove, searching for anything, a scrap of fabric, a lost button, a trace of her passing. There was nothing. The field gave up no secrets. I stayed there until my hands went numb, until the cold settled deep in my bones. I thought about the confession in the quilt, the letter in the attic, the visitor who had come at dusk with wildflowers in her hands. I thought about all the pieces of Ruth's life I had gathered, each one a fragment, a clue, a question with no answer. I wondered if I would ever understand what had driven her out into the frozen field, what sorrow or hope had carried her beyond the reach of home. As I turned to leave, I looked back at the house, its windows glowing faintly in the distance. It seemed smaller now, fragile against the vastness of the snow. I felt a wave of loneliness, sharp and sudden, as if the field itself was pressing in on me, reminding me of all that had been lost. I walked back slowly, my footprints the only mark on the white, knowing they too would vanish by morning. Inside, the warmth felt strange, almost unreal. I sat by the stove, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and watched the snow fall outside the window. The world was quiet, the silence deep and unbroken. I thought about Ruth's fear of the cold, her longing for escape, her quiet strength. I wondered if she had found what she was looking for, out there in the frozen field, or if she was still searching, still waiting for someone to follow. That night I dreamed of Ruth standing in the field, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes bright with something I couldn't name. She turned to me, her hand outstretched, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The snow fell between us, soft and endless, and when I woke, the house was dark, the silence complete. I lay there, listening to the wind, the slow ticking of the clock, the sound of my own breath. I wondered what it meant to let someone go, to accept that some mysteries would never be solved, some questions never answered. I wondered if Ruth had found peace, or if she was still wandering, somewhere beyond the frozen field, her footprints lost to the snow.
It was a Sunday when I finally gathered the courage to speak. The church bell rang out over the snow, its sound thin and distant, carried on the wind. I walked to the church hall with the quilt folded under my arm, the confession tucked inside, my heart heavy with the weight of what I was about to share. The sky was pale, the sun a weak coin behind the clouds, and the world felt suspended, as if waiting for something to change. Inside, the hall was warm, the air thick with the scent of coffee and old wood. The townsfolk sat in small clusters, their voices low, their eyes tired. I stood at the front, the quilt spread across the table, the confession resting on top. My hands shook as I smoothed the fabric, the colors faded but still bright in the lamplight. I looked out at the faces, neighbors, friends, people who had known Ruth in ways I never could. I cleared my throat, the sound loud in the hush. "I want to tell you about Ruth," I began, my voice rough with nerves. "I want to tell you what she carried, what she left behind." I picked up the confession, the paper soft and worn from being read so many times. I read the words aloud, my voice trembling but steady, the silence in the room growing deeper with every line. I told them about the secret Ruth had kept, about the love and the loss, about the sorrow that had followed her from another life. As I spoke, I saw the pain in their eyes, the shock, the sadness, the understanding. Some looked away, others nodded, their faces softening with memory. I told them about the letter in the attic, about the visitor who had come at dusk, about the pieces of Ruth's life I had only just begun to understand. I spoke of forgiveness, of the ways we try to mend what's broken, of the hope that comes from telling the truth, even when it hurts. When I finished, the room was silent. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, the slow settling of the building around us. I felt exposed, raw, as if I had opened a wound for all to see. But I also felt lighter, as if some of the weight I had carried had been lifted, shared among those who had loved Ruth in their own quiet ways. Mrs. Larkins stood, her hands clasped in front of her. She spoke softly, her voice steady. "We all have secrets," she said. "We all have things we wish we could change. Ruth was no different. She was kind, and she was strong, and she did the best she could." Others nodded, their faces shining with tears. The room felt different now, softer, gentler, as if the truth had made space for something new. Afterward, people came to me, their words quiet, their hands warm on my shoulder. They shared stories of Ruth, small kindnesses, moments of laughter, memories I had never heard. Each story was a thread, weaving her back into the fabric of the town, reminding me that she was more than her sorrow, more than her secrets. She was loved, and she was missed, and she would not be forgotten. I walked home alone, the quilt folded under my arm, the confession tucked safely away. The snow fell softly, covering the footprints in the road, the world hushed and clean. I thought about Ruth, about the pain she had carried, about the peace I hoped she had found. I thought about the power of telling the truth, about the way it can break us open and heal us at the same time. That night I sat by the window, the quilt draped over my knees, the house quiet around me. I listened to the wind, to the distant sound of the river, to the silence that was no longer empty, but full of memory and hope. I wondered if the truth could bring peace, or only more sorrow. I wondered if Ruth could hear me wherever she was, and if she knew she was forgiven. The lamp in the window burned late into the night, its light a small beacon against the dark. I watched the snow fall, soft and endless, and felt the world shift just a little toward something like healing.
The thaw came slow that year, as if winter was reluctant to loosen its grip. Each morning I watched the snow recede from the fields, the white giving way to patches of brown earth and the first hints of green. The river, once silent and frozen, began to move again, slow at first, then with a restless urgency, breaking the ice into jagged sheets that drifted downstream. I found myself drawn to its banks, to the place where Ruth's quilt had washed ashore, as if the water might still hold some trace of her. The air was sharp with the smell of mud and melting snow. The ground was soft beneath my boots, each step sinking a little deeper, the world waking up from its long sleep. I walked along the river's edge, the current dark and cold, carrying away the last fragments of ice. The trees on the far bank were bare, their branches reflected in the water, trembling with the wind. I listened to the sound of the river, the low rush and gurgle, and felt something inside me begin to shift. I stopped where the reeds grew thick, where the quilt had been found, tangled and heavy with water. The memory of that morning came back to me, the hush of the crowd, the weight of the fabric in my arms, the secret folded into its lining. I knelt in the mud, my hands searching through the debris left by the flood. There were broken branches, bits of glass, a child's lost mitten, faded and sodden. I sifted through it all, not sure what I was looking for, only that I needed to find something, anything to hold on to. My fingers closed around something small and hard, half buried in the silt. I pulled it free. A locket, its chain tangled with river grass, the metal dulled by water and time. I turned it over in my palm, feeling the weight of it, the way it seemed to hum with memory. The clasp was rusted, but I worked it open, careful not to break it. Inside was a photograph, curled and faded, the image blurred but still recognizable. Ruth, younger than I'd ever seen her, her hair loose around her shoulders, her smile bright and unguarded. Beside her stood someone I didn't know, a woman with dark eyes and a gentle smile, her arm around Ruth's waist. I sat back on my heels, the locket open in my hand, the river moving slow beside me. I wondered who the woman was, what she had meant to Ruth, what story the photograph told. I thought about the letter in the attic, the visitor at dusk, the confession in the quilt. Each piece was a thread, weaving together a life I had only ever glimpsed in fragments. I felt a pang of regret, sharp and sudden, for all the questions I had never asked, all the stories I would never hear. The sun broke through the clouds, the light catching on the water, turning it to silver. I closed the locket, slipping it into my pocket, and stood. The river was high, the current strong, carrying away the last of the winter's debris. I watched as a branch spun in the eddy, then disappeared downstream, lost to the world. I thought about letting go, about what it meant to release someone you loved, to accept that some mysteries would remain unsolved. I walked home slowly, the locket heavy in my pocket, the photograph pressed close to my heart. The house was quiet when I returned, the air inside warmer, softer, as if the walls themselves were beginning to breathe again. I sat by the window, the river visible in the distance, the fields turning green at the edges. I turned the locket over in my hands, tracing the outline of Ruth's face, the curve of her smile, the shadow of the woman beside her. That night, I placed the locket on the table beside Ruth's quilt, the two of them side by side, pieces of a story I was still learning to read. I sat in the quiet, listening to the river, to the wind in the trees, to the slow, steady beat of my own heart. I wondered what it meant to let go of someone you never truly knew, to love them anyway, to carry their memory forward into the light of a new season. The river kept moving, restless and sure, carving its path through the fields, carrying away the last of the winter's sorrow. I watched it from the window, the water shining in the moonlight, and felt something inside me begin to thaw. I didn't have all the answers, but I had the locket, the quilt, the memory of Ruth's laughter, and the hope that somewhere she had found peace. As the night deepened, I closed my eyes and listened to the river, its song soft and endless, carrying me forward into whatever came next.
Spring arrived quietly, almost shy, as if it was afraid to disturb the hush that winter had left behind. The snow melted in slow patches, revealing the dark, rich earth beneath. The fields, once white and endless, began to show hints of green, small shoots pushing up through the thaw, stubborn and bright. I watched from the window each morning, the air still cold but full of promise, the world waking up in its own time. I took Ruth's quilt from the cedar chest and hung it in the front window, letting the sun warm its faded colors. The fabric, once stiff from river water, had softened with time and care. In the morning light, the patterns glowed, patches of blue and red, a sunburst of yellow, the story of her hands stitched into every seam. People passing by would pause, their faces thoughtful, sometimes pressing a hand to the glass as if to touch the memory she'd left behind. The house felt different now. The silence was still there, but it was gentler, filled with the sounds of the world returning. Birds calling from the orchard, the distant rush of the river, the creak of the porch as neighbors came and went. I found myself opening the windows, letting in the scent of damp earth and new grass. I swept the floors, aired out the rooms, moved through the house with a kind of quiet purpose. Each task was a way of saying goodbye, and also a way of holding on. I visited the field one last time, the ground soft beneath my boots, the air bright with the promise of rain. The willow tree stood at the edge, its branches tipped with green, the first leaves trembling in the breeze. I stood where Ruth's footprints had ended, the memory of that winter night still sharp in my mind. I closed my eyes and listened, to the wind, to the river, to the faint echo of Ruth's laughter drifting through the grass. I whispered her name, a soft goodbye, and let the silence carry it away. Back at the house, I sat by the window, the quilt glowing in the afternoon sun. I traced the stitches with my fingers, remembering the stories Ruth had told, the secrets she had kept, the love she had given so quietly. I thought about the confession in the quilt, the letter in the attic, the locket found by the river. Each piece was a part of her, a part of me, woven together by time and memory. The town moved forward, changed but not broken. People spoke of Ruth in gentle voices, their stories weaving her back into the fabric of Larkspur. They brought flowers for the window, left notes on the porch, shared memories over coffee and pie. I listened, grateful for their kindness, for the way they helped me remember not just Ruth's sorrow, but her laughter, her strength, her quiet grace. As the days grew longer, the fields turned green again, the orchard filled with blossoms, the river ran clear and fast. I found myself smiling more, the ache in my chest easing with each sunrise. I tended the garden, planted seeds in the soft earth, watched as new life took root. I carried Ruth's memory with me, not as a weight, but as a light, something to guide me through the days ahead.
One morning, as the first light spilled across the fields, I stood at the window and felt a sense of peace settle over me. The quilt glowed in the sun, the house warm and full of quiet hope. I thought of Ruth, of all the ways she had loved and been loved, of the mysteries she had left behind. I knew I would never have all the answers, but I had learned to live with the questions, to find comfort in the spaces between. The world was new again, the air sweet with the promise of spring. I opened the door, stepped out into the light, and let the day carry me forward. The snow was gone, the truth had come to rest, and in the hush of early morning, I whispered a final goodbye. The wind caught my words, carried them out across the fields, and somewhere, I hoped, Ruth heard them, soft and sure, a promise that she would never be forgotten.